Tucked deep in the rural woods of northern Vermont lies a place most maps barely bother to name, Elmridge. A dot on a weathered highway sign, often missed in the blur of pine trees and fogged-up windshields. Fewer than 1,300 people call it home, and most of them are born, live, and die within its quiet boundary lines. It's a town where the gas station also sells bait, the diner knows your order by heart, and people don't lock their doors. Not because they're careless, but because for generations there's never been a reason to. Nothing much ever happens in Elmridge. The days pass slowly, measured by the rhythm of the seasons, blistering summers heavy with humidity, fiery autumns that set the hills ablaze, and long, bone-white winters that seem to stretch into forever. Life here is predictable, maybe even a little boring to outsiders, but to the people of Elmridge, that predictability was a kind of comfort, a sign that the world, despite its chaos elsewhere, still had places untouched by madness. That all changed on the night of October 17th, 2003. The day started like any other. Fog clung to the ground in the early morning, fading into a crisp, cool afternoon. A Friday. Kids at the local elementary school carved pumpkins for an upcoming harvest fair. The high school football team prepped for an away game, and down at Millie's Cafe the regulars drank bad coffee and argued about deer season. It was the kind of day you'd forget the next morning, utterly uneventful. But for the Granger family, it would be their last. Jonathan and Elise Granger were the kind of people everyone in town admired. Not flashy or loud, just steady. He was a science teacher at the high school, soft-spoken and deeply respected. Students described him as fair, calm, the kind of teacher who made you care about things like physics and geology. Elise ran a small flower shop off Main Street, Granger's Blooms. She had a reputation for her beautiful arrangements and for remembering birthdays even when her customers forgot their own. Their children, Emily and Thomas, were often seen riding their bikes up and down Maple Hollow Road, a dirt path that wound through the trees and led to their family's old white farmhouse. Emily was 9, already a little bookish and shy like her father. Thomas was 6 and wild in the way only young boys can be. Always running, always asking questions. They had a golden retriever named Pepper, who was so friendly, he once followed the mailman back to the post office. The Grangers were in every way normal, perhaps a little too normal. There was nothing unusual about them, no whispers of scandal, no unpaid debts, no bitter feuds or late-night shouting matches. They attended church on Sundays, hosted cookouts in the summer, and carved jack-o'-lanterns each Halloween. Their lives were open books. If the town had any secrets, the Grangers didn't seem to be part of them. And yet, sometime between the stillness of midnight and the pale blue light of morning, their world, this quiet, small-town world, was ripped apart in a way no one could explain. 4 lives were taken with an intensity so brutal, so precise, it seemed less like a crime of passion and more like a performance, a message. It wasn't until Jonathan failed to show up at school that anyone knew something was wrong. He had never missed a day without calling. Not once in 17 years. His fellow teachers tried reaching him, but calls went unanswered. Texts sat unread. Elise didn't open her flower shop that morning either, an even rarer occurrence, especially on a Saturday, her busiest day. At first, people assumed something mundane, maybe a family emergency, maybe a broken-down car, but then the school secretary remembered something odd. Elise had called 2 days prior to ask about the school's emergency closure policy. She hadn't explained why. It was enough to cause a ripple of unease. By 8, a patrol car from the Elmridge County Sheriff's Office pulled up the long gravel driveway leading to the Granger house. The property sat nestled between thick woods, dense pine and birch, so tall they nearly swallowed the house whole. It was peaceful. Still, a wisp of chimney smoke curled into the morning air, and Pepper the dog sat silently on the porch, as if waiting. The responding deputy would later say he knew something was wrong the moment he stepped out of his cruiser. It was too quiet, even for Elmridge. There were no bird song, no movement, and Pepper didn't bark or wag her tail. She just stared, eyes fixed on the front door. When the deputy knocked, There was no answer. He circled the house. All the windows were closed. No signs of damage. No signs of a break-in. What he saw inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. At first glance, the kitchen looked normal. A few breakfast dishes in the sink, a cup of coffee, half finished, still warm. But then just beyond the kitchen island, the scene shifted. A body, Elise's, lay sprawled on the floor, blood soaked into the tiles around her, already darkening. Her eyes were open, glassy, staring upward at nothing. Jonathan was found nearby, slumped over the kitchen table, a deep wound to his throat. The chair beside him had been knocked over. There were drag marks on the floor, indicating he may have tried to stand, or reach for something, or someone. It only got worse. Upstairs in their shared bedroom, Emily and Thomas were found in their beds, still tucked in, as if someone had wanted to preserve the illusion of peace. But both children had been killed, each in a different way. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs that they ever woke up. The horror was deliberate, methodical, chilling. The call went out, and soon the house was crawling with investigators, their boots crunching across gravel and fallen leaves as news of the killings spread through town like wildfire. It was the first murder in Elmridge in over 30 years, and now suddenly, there were 4 bodies, a whole family, gone, erased, slaughtered in the one place they were supposed to be safest. The sheriff would later call it a nightmare wrapped in silence, because that's what it was. There was no witness, no clear point of entry, no frantic 911 call, nothing that made any immediate sense. The local paper ran a headline that simply read, "Murder comes to Elmridge," but even that felt like an understatement. For the townspeople, shock turned to fear almost overnight. Kids were pulled from school, locks were changed, guns were bought. Some people refused to sleep without leaving lights on. Some couldn't sleep at all. The Grangers were the town's backbone, and if it could happen to them, quiet, decent, good-hearted people, then it could happen to anyone. But what unsettled people most wasn't just the violence. It was the fact that no one saw anything, no one heard anything, and as days turned into weeks, that absence of answers only grew darker, deeper, more unsettling. The killer, or killers, had vanished. The only clue left behind was a single handprint on the wall of the hallway, made in blood. It was small, almost child-sized, but it didn't match the children or the parents. To this day that print remains unidentified, and so Elmridge changed. The flower shop closed for good. The school planted a tree in memory of the children, but most people avoided walking past it. The Granger house sat empty for 3 years before a fire burned it to the ground. The cause, unknown. Some say the town never recovered. Some say it never will, because every October, when the air turns cold and the leaves begin to fall, the memories return. People whisper about that night, the unspeakable violence, the mystery that left no trail. They still call it the midnight slaughter, and they still ask the same question: who killed the Grangers and why? In a town like Elmridge, you get used to seeing the same faces every day. That's just the way life works. In places where time doesn't feel like it's moving all that fast. Everyone knows what everyone else drives, where they shop, what church they go to, and whether their lawn's been mowed. In that kind of place, the word normal takes on a deeper meaning. It becomes a badge of identity. To be normal means you're trusted, reliable, stable. The Grangers weren't just normal, they were good, almost disarmingly so. Jonathan Granger had a quiet way about him, the kind of man who never raised his voice, even when he was frustrated. He wore corduroy jackets to school, kept pens in his shirt pocket, and always seemed to carry the scent of coffee and chalk. Students at Elmridge High described him as soft-spoken, but sharp, with a dry sense of humor that you had to lean in close to catch. He taught biology and physics, and he had this uncanny ability to make the most boring concepts sound like the secret workings of the universe. He ran the science club, volunteered to chaperone dances when no one else wanted to, and even coached the middle school robotics team during the off-season. Every fall, he'd decorate his classroom with paper bats and plastic skeletons, playing spooky sound effects through an old tape deck he refused to replace. And every June, without fail, he'd send handwritten thank you cards to each of his graduating seniors. Elise Granger was no less admired. She had moved to Elmridge from Montpelier in her early 20s, after inheriting a small amount of money from an aunt she'd barely known. Rather than leave it sitting in a savings account, she used it to open a flower shop, a narrow little storefront nestled between the town's post office and the barber. Granger's Blooms, the sign read, painted by hand with curling vines along the edge. Inside, the air always smelled like lavender and eucalyptus. The windows were often fogged from the warmth of the greenhouse in the back, and there was usually a cat sleeping somewhere in the sun. Elise knew her customers by name. She kept a notepad behind the counter with everyone's birthdays and anniversaries, often reminding husbands of dates they'd forgotten and saving wives from having to ask twice. If a child came in with a few crumpled dollars to buy flowers for their mother, she'd give them a bouquet and tuck a tiny note into the ribbon that said, "You're doing great." She had this way of making people feel seen, not just noticed, but known. And yet she never seemed to seek attention. She was one of those people who smiled with her eyes more than her mouth, who listened more than she spoke. Together, Jonathan and Elise made sense. They were quiet in the same way, grounded in routines that gave their life rhythm. Sunday pancakes, Friday night movies with the kids, gardening on Saturday mornings. Their house, a whitewashed two-story farmhouse with green shutters and a wraparound porch, sat at the edge of a clearing surrounded by thick woods. It wasn't new or fancy. The paint peeled in places, the swing on the porch creaked, but it had warmth, life. You could feel it just by driving past. Inside, their world was full of little rituals. Emily and Thomas had core charts on the fridge. They helped set the table. They had a dog, Pepper, who followed them from room to room, never far behind. Emily, the older of the two, was the quiet one, 9 years old and already in love with books. She was the type of child who always had a flashlight tucked beneath her pillow, and a stack of fantasy novels hidden under her bed. Teachers said she was thoughtful, observant, sometimes a little too mature for her age, as though she understood more than she let on. Thomas at 6 was her opposite, loud, joyful, endlessly curious. He collected bugs in mason jars, climbed trees he probably shouldn't have, and once flushed an entire deck of playing cards down the upstairs toilet. But even when he got into trouble, it was hard to stay mad at him. His laugh had this contagious quality, the kind of thing that made even strangers smile. The family did ordinary things in extraordinary ways. On Halloween, they didn't just carve pumpkins. They built elaborate displays with fog machines and animatronics Jonathan rigged from spare parts. At Christmas, they made handmade ornaments and hung popcorn strings on the porch. During the summer, they camped in their own backyard, roasting marshmallows over a fire pit and reading ghost stories until the kids fell asleep in sleeping bags. There was something deeply human about the Grange, something that made them feel not just relatable, but real. You didn't have to know them well to care about them. It was enough to pass them on the street and get a wave, enough to hear their laughter echoing across the field behind their house, enough to watch Emily hold Thomas's hand at the 4th of July parade and know that some families still raised their children right. It's because of all that, because of their goodness, their innocence, that what happened doesn't make sense. There had been no warning signs, no strange visitors, no family arguments overheard through thin walls, no cryptic social media posts, no ominous diary entries found later. If anything, the weeks leading up to October 17th had been uneventful, boring, even. Elise had hosted a small flower arranging workshop the Saturday before. Jonathan had stayed late at school to help a student with a science fair project. Emily had gone to a friend's birthday party and come home with cake frosting on her sleeve. Thomas had caught a frog in the creek behind the house and insisted they keep it as a pet, though they let it go 2 days later. There was nothing to suggest danger was coming, no storm on the horizon, just a quiet family in a quiet town, living out their lives in a place that promised nothing bad could happen. That's what made the aftermath so devastating. When the news broke that the Grangers had been found dead in their home, murdered, not by accident or tragedy, but deliberately. People didn't believe it, couldn't, not just because of the horror itself, but because it didn't fit. It didn't belong, not in Elmridge, not to them. In small towns, when someone dies, people show up, with casseroles, with tears, with flowers and folding chairs and stories. But after the Grangers were buried, 4 caskets, side by side, under a gray October sky, what lingered wasn't comfort, it was fear, and something deeper, something colder. Because if a family like the Grangers could be slaughtered in their own home, what hope did the rest of them have? People searched for answers, of course, whispered about old grudges, buried secrets, distant relatives. Some said Jonathan had gotten involved in something dark online. Others believed Elise had been hiding something, maybe an affair, maybe a stalker. There were even those who insisted the children had been targeted, as if that somehow made more sense. But none of it held water. None of it brought the peace they craved. Instead, all anyone could do was look backward, at their own memories of the Grangers, the borrowed cups of sugar, the PTA meetings, the flowers Elise had sent after a neighbor's miscarriage, the tutoring Jonathan gave a failing senior, free of charge, the sight of Emily curled up on the library carpet, reading while Thomas pretended to be a ninja in the background. Those memories became sacred, untouchable, and unbearably painful. In the months that followed, the flower shop remained closed. Dust gathered on the counter. A single bouquet left by a former customer withered in its vase. The school planted a tree in the Granger's honor, but no one visited it. It stood there silent, growing without an audience. The Granger house too sat untouched, the curtains drawn, the grass uncut, the porch swing still. Occasionally someone would say they saw a light in the window, heard Pepper barking, though the dog had been taken in by a relative, or caught a glimpse of Emily's silhouette in the upstairs bedroom. But the house was empty. Everyone knew. What no one knew or still knows is why it happened, why that family, why that night. Who could have done something so brutal, so calculated, so wrong? But in Elmridge, they never stopped asking, because if the Grangers weren't safe, no one is. It was a cold night, colder than usual for mid-October, the kind of cold that slipped under your coat collar and crawled up your spine, the kind of night when the wind made the trees whisper and the leaves sounded like footsteps just beyond the edge of the light. By all accounts, October 17th had been ordinary. That, in retrospect, was the most chilling thing of all. Elise closed the flower shop at 5:00 p.m., as she always did on Fridays. She'd spent the afternoon making centerpieces for a local wedding, and preparing bouquets for the harvest festival coming up the following week. According to her coworker, she had seemed tired, but cheerful. She mentioned that Thomas had caught a cold. Nothing serious, just a runny nose and a stubborn cough. She was planning to make chicken soup. Jonathan left school shortly after 5:30. He had stayed late to grade midterm exam. Several students saw him in his classroom, flipping through papers with his reading glasses perched low on his nose. One of his seniors waved goodbye and asked if he'd be at the football game that night. He said no, he was heading home for a quiet night, in with the family. Emily had gone to a friend's house after school, just down the road. A girl named Sophie. They watched a Halloween movie and ate popcorn. Sophie's mother said she seemed perfectly normal, happy. She'd told her friend she was excited for the costume party at school the next week. Emily was planning to dress as a forest fairy. Thomas, still sniffling, had stayed home with Pepper. He colored at the kitchen table while Elise cooked, filling the house with the smell of herbs and roasted garlic. Just before 8:00, Jonathan returned, and the 4 of them sat down for dinner together. A normal Friday evening. Laughter, dishes clinking, the warm hush of a house preparing for the weekend. At 8:45, Elise called her sister in Montpelier. They spoke for nearly 15 minutes. It was a light conversation, nothing unusual. She mentioned that Emily had finally cleaned her room without being asked, and that Jonathan had fixed the jammed front door lock. She ended the call with "Talk to you Sunday," and a soft laugh. Around 9:15, the lights dimmed in the upstairs bedrooms. Emily was reading a book under her blanket,
Thomas had fallen asleep while watching a cartoon. Jonathan was downstairs, sipping tea and going over lesson plans. Elise folded laundry and set out the kids' clothes for the next morning. There was a calmness to it all, a softness, but by morning the entire family would be dead. The first sign that something wasn't right came around 11:30 p.m. A woman named Rose Dalka, who lived 2 acres away, reported hearing a sound she couldn't explain. A single high-pitched scream that seemed to cut through the trees, followed by 3 sharp bangs. She told police later she had assumed it was teens shooting off fireworks in the woods. She wasn't the only one. A man walking his dog along Mill Creek Trail thought he saw flickering light near the Granger property. He assumed it was their porch light, or maybe someone lighting a fire pit. No one thought to call the police. Why would they? What happened between 11:30 and 12:30 remains the most tightly contested and horrifying hour in Elmridge's history. Investigators would later estimate that the murders occurred between 12:03 and 12:18 a.m., based on lividity, internal temperature, and time of last known activity. A kitchen wall clock had stopped at exactly 12:11 a.m., its glass face shattered. They believe it was struck mid-struggle. That time, stamped more than any other clue, became the story's black anchor. When deputies arrived the next morning at 8:06 a.m., the scene was still. The front door was closed. Pepper was sitting on the porch, silent, tail curled around her feet, as if she had been waiting all night. No barking, no whining, just that eerie, wordless stare. Inside, the house was dim, curtains drawn, lights off. No signs of a break-in, no windows forced, no footprints leading in or out. The kitchen smelled faintly of burnt soup. A pot sat cold on the stove, its contents blackened and stuck to the bottom. Then the deputy turned the corner. Elise was the first body they found. She lay on the tile floor, blood pooled around her like an ink stain, her hand outstretched, as if she had been reaching for something or someone. Her expression was frozen in horror, mouth open, eyes wide. She had been stabbed multiple times in the abdomen and chest. The wounds were deep, precise. Jonathan was nearby, slumped at the table. His throat had been cut from left to right with surgical accuracy. He had bled out almost instantly, his hand still clutching a red pen. There were scratch marks on the side of his neck, as if he had tried to fight back. Blood splatter analysis indicated he was killed sitting down. No evidence of a chase, no time to scream. Then came the stairs. Upstairs, the scene took on an even darker tone. The children's rooms were undisturbed. No signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken windows, just the small, cozy world of 2 children asleep in their beds. Emily was found beneath her blanket, her favorite book resting on the nightstand. She had been smothered, a pillow pressed hard over her face. No defensive wounds, no signs of panic. Thomas lay on his stomach, curled into himself like a question mark. He too had been smothered, but more violently. His tiny fists were clenched. A few strands of golden retriever hair were found clutched in his hand, likely transferred from Pepper earlier that night. There was no clear order of death, but investigators believed the killer, or killers, moved with disturbing control. Systematic, calculated. They began upstairs with the children, then descended to eliminate the parents, or the reverse. No one is certain. The only thing that was clear was the precision. Different weapons were used. Elise was stabbed. Jonathan had his throat cut. The children were smothered. No single method, no single signature. One horrifying possibility emerged in the following days. The killer may have been in the house before the family went to bed. That theory came from an officer who found muddy footprints in the crawl space beneath the home. They led to an interior air vent, just wide enough for someone small and flexible to crawl through. The vent opened behind the laundry room cabinet. It could be accessed from inside the house. The dust on the floor had been disturbed. Someone had moved through that space recently. Then came the handprint. On the hallway wall just between the kitchen and the stairs, investigators found a small blood-smeared handprint, about the size of a child's. But the positioning was wrong, too high for Thomas or Emily. It wasn't theirs, and it wasn't Elise's. The print had ridges, consistent with adult hands, but it was narrow, almost delicate. It didn't match Jonathan or any known visitor to the house. The blood belonged to Elise. That single handprint would become the most infamous detail of the entire case. A whisper in blood, a phantom trace. It said only one thing: someone else was here. Yet no DNA was found. No fingerprints on doorknobs, no glove fibers, no hair, no semen, no skin cells. The house, while bloody, was clean in all the ways that mattered to investigators. Too clean. It didn't take long for the press to get hold of the story. A headline in a Burlington newspaper dubbed it "The Midnight Slaughter." It stuck. Locals hated the term. It made something sacred into spectacle, but they couldn't deny it captured the scale of the horror. For days, then weeks, the town was locked in fear. People checked under beds, double-bolted doors. Children wet their beds and refused to sleep in their own rooms. Families who'd lived in Elmridge for generations began talking about moving away. Pastors gave sermons about evil. Therapists were booked solid. Because this wasn't just murder, it was annihilation. A whole family erased in the span of 15 minutes, by a killer no one saw coming, who left no trace, no message, no motive, just that eerie handprint, and a town that would never be the same.
There are crime scenes, and then there are puzzles, silent, frozen fragments of something horrific that's already happened, something you can't stop or undo. All you can do is walk through the blood, past the broken furniture and shattered glass, and try to piece together the truth from the debris. But what the police found inside the Granger home wasn't just a puzzle. It was a contradiction. A quiet war between what should be and what was. From the outside, the house was as it always had been, a modest white farmhouse framed by birch trees and silence. There was no smoke, no open doors, no broken windows. The flower beds remained untouched, and Elise's pumpkins still sat on the porch, carved 2 days earlier by Emily and Thomas. One had started to slump in on itself, a soft mold growing along the edges of the grate. The wind occasionally rocked the porch swing back and forth, giving the illusion of life in a place where it had just been stolen. Inside, however, something else entirely was waiting. The crime scene photos, most of which have never been released to the public, show an environment frozen in a moment of violence. But what struck investigators wasn't just the brutality of the scene, it was the lack of chaos. Typically, in a home invasion or family murder, there are signs of panic, signs of life fighting back. Overturned furniture, smashed items, rushed exits, bloody footprints. But in the Granger house, the violence had been quiet, focused, chillingly precise. The sheriff's office quickly brought in state investigators from Montpelier. By the next day, the entire property had been taped off. The gravel driveway was filled with unmarked vehicles, white-suited forensic techs, and the low murmur of stunned professionals trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The first problem: the doors. Both the front and back doors had been locked from the inside, dead-bolted. The windows were also secure. No forced entry, no shattered glass, not even scratches on the latches. That suggested two options, neither of which made any sense. Option 1, the killer had a key, someone close to the family, someone trusted. Option 2, the killer was already inside before the doors were locked for the night. Then came the second issue: the silence. None of the neighbors heard anything beyond what had already been reported. A muffled scream, possibly fireworks, but nothing else. And in a house with 4 people being killed over the span of 15 minutes, you'd expect some kind of noise, a gunshot, a struggle, a panicked cry. But there had been nothing, nothing loud enough to disturb the night. There was also no sign of a robbery. Nothing was missing. Not Elise's wedding ring, not the safe under their bed. The drawers weren't rummaged through, and the electronics remained in place. The killer, it seemed, didn't come for money. One detective on the case said it best: this wasn't a break-in, it was a message. But if it was a message, no one could read it. Forensic investigators combed the house inch by inch. They dusted every surface, bagged every item out of place. They mapped blood patterns, collected fibers, photographed every room, and yet nothing. No fingerprints, no DNA, no hairs, no clothing fibers. It was as if the killer had been made of smoke. The one glaring exception, of course, was the blood. There was a lot of it, especially in the kitchen, where Elise had bled out. Her wounds, 9 stab wounds to the torso, were deep and targeted. The medical examiner noted that none were frenzied, no hesitation marks. This wasn't the work of someone in a rage. It was controlled, efficient. Jonathan's wound, a clean slice across the throat, mirrored something surgical. He had been sitting at the table when he was attacked. There was a coffee cup beside him, still half full, and a red pen in his right hand. His blood was pooled beneath the chair, seeping slowly into the floorboards. He hadn't moved far. He hadn't had the chance. There were no defensive wounds on either parent, which meant the killer either attacked from behind or incapacitated them too quickly for resistance, or they never saw it coming at all. The children's rooms told a different story. Emily had been tucked neatly under the covers. Her body showed signs of smothering. No bruising, no trauma, just peaceful stillness, with blue lips and empty eyes. Thomas, in the adjacent room, had struggled slightly. He had scratch marks on his neck, tiny abrasions on his knuckles, a few strands of hair clenched in his fist, but nothing that suggested he ever saw his attacker. Again, there were no signs of forced entry into either bedroom, no boot prints, no mud, no blood trails, just those 2 little beds, and the absence of breathing. And then there was the hallway. Just outside the children's rooms in the narrow upstairs hallway, investigators discovered what would become the most infamous clue in the entire investigation: a single bloody handprint smeared across the pale green wallpaper, like an echo of something unspoken. It was high on the wall, about shoulder height for an adult, but the size of the print was odd. Narrow fingers, shorter than average. No match for Jonathan or Elise, and certainly not for the children. When they ran the print through local and federal databases, it returned no matches. No criminals, no arrests, no hospital records, nothing. It was a ghost's hand, a phantom signature. Worse still, the blood in the handprint was confirmed to belong to Elise, which meant the killer had touched her, or been near her, after she was already wounded, or dead. This handprint became the centerpiece of the case, recreated in sketches, pored over in labs, debated on forums. Every detail of the print was analyzed: the ridges, the curve of the palm, the way the blood had been smeared slightly downward, as if the hand had paused there for a moment, almost as if admiring something. The hallway light above the print was missing its bulb, deliberately unscrewed. That detail haunts people the most, because it meant someone had been in that hallway, in the dark, without needing light to see. Or worse, they preferred it that way. Cops searched the crawl spaces, the attic, the basement. That's when they discovered the air vent. It connected the basement crawl space to the interior wall behind the laundry room, and from there to the second floor. It was a tight fit, no doubt. Only someone small, agile and very determined could have navigated it, but the dust had clearly been disturbed. Had the killer used the vent to enter, or to hide? Even more chilling, there was an old wool blanket crumpled in the crawl space, an empty water bottle, candy wrapper. Someone had been down there recently, maybe hours before the murders, maybe days. The theory began to take shape, and it was horrifying. Someone had been living inside the house. It wouldn't be the first time something like that had happened. Cases across the country have surfaced, where squatters lived in attics, behind walls in basements, but it had never happened in Elmridge, and it had never ended like this. But if that theory was true, it posed a terrifying possibility. The killer had watched the Grangers, learned their routines, knew their habits, slept when they slept, moved when they were gone, and then struck, not from outside, but from within. The psychological profile assembled by the state forensic team was disturbing. They theorized the killer was highly intelligent, possibly obsessive, likely male, possibly underweight or small in stature, capable of strategic violence, patient, comfortable with confined spaces, possibly even living with a dissociative disorder, or functioning under a delusional belief system. None of that brought them closer to a name. There were no suspects. No neighbors reported anyone strange lurking around the house. No security cameras caught unusual activity.
No fingerprints, no DNA, no motive. And so, the Grangers were buried, and their house was sealed with yellow tape. The silence left behind was deafening. It became clearer with each passing day. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, and they were gone before anyone knew they were even there. It didn't take long for rumors to spread in Elmridge. Within days of the Granger murders, the town that once felt cozy and predictable became a place of hushed conversations and sidelong glances. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had a secret to share, and everyone, it seemed, had someone they thought might be capable of something unspeakable. The police didn't want theories, they wanted leads. They began, as they always do, by looking inward, at the Grangers themselves. The first question was painful, but necessary. Did someone in the family have enemies? Jonathan Granger had been a local high school history teacher, a quiet man, by all accounts, with a habit of staying late in his classroom and an obsession with World War II memorabilia. No criminal record, no complaints from parents or students, but one detail raised eyebrows. 3 weeks before the murders, he had reported a break-in at the school. His classroom had been vandalized, maps slashed, files dumped, nothing stolen. When asked if he suspected anyone, Jonathan gave the police a name: Liam O'Hara. Liam had been expelled the previous year for threatening another student with a utility knife. He had a history of mental health issues, and had blamed Jonathan for ruining his life. When officers questioned Liam, he denied the vandalism and the murders. He claimed to have been in Burlington the night the Grangers were killed, visiting his grandmother. She confirmed his story. Her home security footage backed it up. He was ruled out, but not entirely forgotten. Then there was Elise Granger, stay-at-home mother, PTA secretary, amateur baker, but behind the soft smiles and neat hair, there was tension. 2 weeks before the murders, Elise had made a series of late-night calls to someone in Montpelier. The number was unlisted. The recipient, a private investigator named Mara Hensley. Mara, when contacted, refused to say much, but what she did say was enough to blow open a new corridor in the case. Elise believed she was being followed. What? She told me she thought someone had been inside the house while they were sleeping. That was 10 days before her death. She had hired Mara to install a hidden camera system, not the usual kind either. Micro cameras in vents, motion sensors in the attic, thermal sensors for crawl spaces. But the system had only partially gone online. Most of the footage was never recorded. The one camera that had started capturing data was in the laundry room. The last image it recorded was strange. It showed a figure, short, thin, wearing a mask made from cloth, possibly burlap. The image was blurred, but the timestamp was chilling. 3:42 a.m., 2 nights before the murders. The figure was emerging from the wall panel behind the dryer. That wall backed directly into the crawl space. The image was real. Mara verified it. The police verified it. But whoever that figure was, they hadn't left fingerprints, no footprints, not even a thread of clothing. Just that one image, smeared and grainy, a living ghost in a homemade mask. Then the attention shifted again, this time to someone closer. Too close, in fact. Elise's sister, Hannah Blythe. Hannah had been vocal, tearful in interviews, quick to defend her sister's memory, but something in her demeanor unnerved detectives. When questioned, she admitted something she hadn't told anyone else. She had argued with Elise the day before the murder. Not just a small fight, a full-blown screaming match, over custody of their late mother's estate. Elise had been named executor. Hannah felt betrayed. She accused Elise of manipulating their mother's will while she was dying of cancer. When asked to explain why she hadn't mentioned the fight earlier, Hannah simply said, "I didn't think it mattered. We made up." She called me later that night and apologized, but phone records showed no such call. In fact, Elise's last outgoing call was at 10 to Mara Hensley again. That call lasted 38 seconds. No one knows what was said. After that, silence. Investigators pressed harder. Hannah's alibi was weak. She said she had been home alone with her dog, asleep. No neighbors saw her. No digital footprint. No proof. But without physical evidence linking her to the crime, there was nothing to charge. Then came the strangest suspect of all. 6 days after the murders, a man walked into the Elmridge sheriff's office and handed over a notebook. His name was Caleb Finn, a drifter known around town for odd jobs, erratic behavior and muttering to himself in public. He said he had found the notebook in the woods behind the Granger property about a mile into the trees, tucked under a rock near the old fire tower. The notebook was leather-bound. Inside were 18 pages of strange writing, phrases like, "They sleep like cattle. The silence is thinner now. She sees me when she prays. He hears me in the dark. The girl knows. The boy listens. Midnight is mine." No name, no drawings, no direct references to the Grangers, but the pages were stained, some with water, some with something darker, possibly blood. Forensics couldn't confirm whose Caleb claimed he didn't write it. He said he just knew the woods well and saw something off. But the police didn't believe him. They searched his trailer. They brought him in for questioning for 12 hours, and then they let him go. Why? Because Caleb had an airtight alibi. He was in police custody on a vagrancy charge the night of the murders, locked up in a cell 2 towns over. Still, the notebook became central to online forums and amateur sleuths. Some believed it was the killer's journal. Others thought it was a hoax. One Redditor, going by the name Midnight Watcher 47, even claimed they could decode the lines into a date, October 31st, the night the Grangers died. Coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. But even as suspicion bounced from Liam to Hannah to a faceless figure in a mask, the case refused to settle. Every suspect brought more questions. Every clue unraveled into a deeper void. And then, as if to fan the flames, something else was discovered. 10 days after the murders, while cleaning the upstairs bathroom, a forensic cleaner found a small scrap of fabric tucked behind the toilet. It was caught in the pipe housing as if it had been torn and discarded in a hurry. The fabric was coarse, woven, the same kind used in potato sacks or homemade masks. On the fabric was a single dark red smudge. It tested positive for blood. Whose blood? It matched none of the Grangers, none of the suspects, not even Caleb. It was an unknown profile, a fifth person, a phantom, an anomaly. The lab report called it male Caucasian, estimated age 20-35. This confirmed the nightmare. Someone else had been in that house, someone they hadn't even identified yet, someone real. Still, the days turned into weeks. The crime scene tape was taken down. The funerals came and went. The Granger home was eventually boarded up. No one wanted to buy it. It stood empty, haunted by more than memory, and the deeper police looked, the less certain they became of everything they thought they knew. The killer hadn't left a calling card, but they had left a message in blood, in silence, in absence. Whoever murdered the Granger family didn't just vanish. They dissolved, melted back into the world, maybe into the woods, maybe back into someone's basement, or maybe they never left at all. Some locals still whisper that the killer could be living in Elmridge, watching, waiting, remembering, because something about that night didn't feel random. It felt orchestrated, personal, like someone had waited for the right time, then made sure the story would never be finished. And now, all that remained were the suspects, the secrets, and the silence. The deeper the investigation dragged on, the less the town of Elmridge seemed to recognize itself. The crime that had shattered the quiet Granger home was now bleeding into everyday life. Church attendance doubled. Doors that had once stayed unlocked were now bolted tight. Parents pulled their kids out of Halloween activities. No one wanted to risk being outside after dark. Not anymore. But something else was happening too. Something strange. It began subtle. Power outages. Brief, flickering episodes, mostly around the north side of town, close to the woods behind the Granger house. Then came the noises, reported by at least 9 separate residents. Rhythmic tapping on windows, scraping sounds beneath floorboards, heavy breathing heard through the vents. No suspects, no signs of break-ins. And then came the girl from the bridge. Her name was Emily Rourke, a 15-year-old sophomore at Elmridge High. On November 10th, just 11 days after the Granger killings, Emily was found by 2 joggers, standing alone on the old Tremblay Bridge. At 4:30 a.m., she was barefoot. Her nightgown was torn. Her hands were covered in dirt. When the joggers approached, she didn't speak. just stared through them with wide, unblinking eyes. When police arrived, she finally whispered one thing: "He's under the house." Emily had no history of sleepwalking or trauma. She lived miles from the Grangers. Her parents claimed she had gone to bed around 11 and was gone when they checked at midnight. There were no signs of forced entry in her home, no car tracks, nothing to suggest she'd been taken, but something about what she said, "He's under the house," sent shivers down the spine of Detective Nolan because Elise Granger had said the same thing. In her notes to private investigator Mara Hensley, Elise had described waking in the night to sounds below her floor. She'd convinced herself animals had burrowed in, or maybe but in one audio recording she'd sent Mara just days before her death, Elise whispered, "It's not animals, it sounds like someone breathing, like he's under the house." There were no known connections between Elise Granger and Emily Rourke, no shared family, no overlapping social circles, yet both of them had said the same thing. And then came the map. While combing through old files, Detective Reese stumbled across a document from 1971, a collection of unsolved murders compiled by a local historian named Margaret Elwyn. In it was a section titled, "The Crawlspace Deaths, 1906. According to Elwyn's notes, 4 different families had died under mysterious circumstances, within a 5-mile radius of what was now the Granger property. In each case, all members of the household were killed, quietly, brutally, with no sign of forced entry. There were minor variations in method, but one detail was eerily consistent. In every case, the youngest child was found outside the house, alive but unresponsive, and in every case, there were reports of sounds in the walls in the weeks leading up to the murder. The earliest case dated back to 1906. The Arliss family slaughtered in their farmhouse on Winter Hill, all but their son Nathan, who was found sitting in the barn rocking and humming a hymn. He never spoke again. The most recent, the Coopers, same pattern, same silence. Their daughter Helen was found on the front porch, clutching a doll, whispering the word "he." The local paper back then had referred to the killer half-jokingly as the man in the crawl space. It had been folklore, a fireside story, something kids whispered about during sleepover. Until now, Reese wasn't a superstitious man, but the patterns were undeniable, and what bothered him most wasn't just the similarities, it was the timing. Each of those historical murders had occurred between late October and early November, roughly 30 years apart, and this was the first one in over 60 years. Reese brought the theory to his captain. He was laughed out of the room, but he kept digging. He contacted Margaret Elwyn's daughter, now living in upstate New York. She agreed to send a box of her mother's unpublished research. Inside were handwritten notes, newspaper clippings, and most chilling of all, an old cassette tape, labeled November 5, 1963, Cooper crime scene. Reese played the tape. At first just static, then a voice, male official sounding. "We're inside the Cooper residence. No sign of forced entry. All victims located in the bedrooms. Minor blood spatter on walls. Requesting assistance for child care. Surviving daughter located on porch, uninjured." Then silence. Then something else. From somewhere in the background, a faint dragging sound, almost like fabric across wood. Then breathing, slow, measured, deep, and then a single knock. Not on a door, on wood, hollow, as if someone was knocking from beneath the floor. Reese had the audio analyzed. It wasn't fake. The technology in 1963 couldn't have manufactured that kind of layering. It was real, and now it was happening again. But who? What was capable of replicating this kind of crime across generations? A drifter, a cult, a copycat, or something worse? Online theorists exploded with speculation. Some believed the Granger home was built on cursed land. Others thought it was an elaborate cover-up, ritualistic killings orchestrated by a secret society hidden within Elmridge. But a smaller, more unsettling theory gained traction. They called it the Hollow Man hypothesis. It claimed that someone, possibly even multiple people, had lived inside the homes of their victims, hidden in walls, attics, or crawl spaces, for days or even weeks before striking, a concept popularized in modern horror, but with roots in several real-life cases. Supporters of the theory pointed to the thermal sensor Mara Hensley installed in the Granger attic, one of the only devices that had gone live before the murders. It had recorded brief heat spikes in the early morning hours on 3 separate days leading up to the killing. The attic should have been cold, but something or someone was up there. One forum user, claiming to be a former electrician for the county, even posted an old blueprint of the Granger home. The crawl space beneath the house, connected to an unmarked drainage tunnel, one that fed into the woods behind the property. It was old, unused for decades, but still there, and it was just wide enough for a person to crawl through. The police investigated the tunnel. They found nothing. No footprints, no DNA, but they didn't search far. The tunnel branched and twisted underground, half collapsed in places, full of rats. Unsafe, they said. But the Hollow Man theorists didn't need evidence. They believed, and some in Elmridge were starting to believe too. A few families moved away quietly in the weeks following the Granger murders. A local contractor reportedly found a hollowed-out gap behind the insulation of a basement in town, large enough for a person to crouch inside. He sealed it shut and refused to speak to the press. People were watching their ceilings now, tapping their own walls, listening, waiting, because whether it was a man, a myth, or something in between, something had returned to Elmridge, and it wasn't done yet. 6 weeks after the murders, Elmridge had changed completely. The trees were bare now. Winter had arrived, cold and still, like the town itself frozen in the shadow of something it couldn't explain. The Granger house had been boarded up by court order. No one was allowed in. Yellow tape wrapped the porch, like a warning from the past. Detective Nolan Reese sat at his desk most days now, staring at open case files, unanswered questions, and a wall covered in photos. Photos of victims, of floor plans, of blueprints, and names. So many names, of people who had vanished or died under mysterious circumstances within a 10-mile radius of that cursed patch of land. Reese couldn't shake the sense that something had been missed, not just by him, but by everyone, every generation before him. Something fundamental, a detail small enough to slip between the cracks, but big enough to let in the dark. One morning in early December, a call came through. A hiker had found something near a ravine 2 miles from the Granger house, something partially buried. Reese left immediately. When he arrived, paramedics were already covering the body. Not an adult, a child, female, maybe 6 or 7, not local. The strangest part, she had no injuries, none visible. She had simply stopped. There were no signs of struggle, no bruises, no mark. Her hands were clean, her eyes closed, almost peaceful. But beside her body something was half buried in the dirt. A stuffed animal, a ragged rabbit, one black button eye missing, and stitched into its chest, barely visible through the grime. A name, Isabel. Nolan's breath caught in his throat. That had been the name of the Granger's youngest daughter. But Isabel Granger had never been found. Not in the house, not in the woods, not anywhere. Her disappearance had been the cruelest part of the tragedy. Her absence, opening doors to all kinds of speculation. Some thought she'd been kidnapped. Others believed she was dead and buried. But no one had imagined this, that she might still be out there, alive, and now, maybe, return. But whose body was this? DNA confirmed the child was not Isabel Granger. But 2 days later, an anonymous letter arrived at the Elmridge Police Department. Just one sentence, typed on paper yellowed at the edges. You didn't find her. She left something behind. Attached to the note was a photo, grainy and distorted. It showed a child standing at the edge of the woods, holding something in her hands. Her face was turned away, but her hair, her size, it matched the last known description of Isabel. The timestamp, the night of the murder. Reese doubled security around his own home after that. And then the Granger house burned. It happened just after midnight, exactly 2 months to the day since the murders. Locals reported hearing a high-pitched wail from the property before flames were seen through the treetop. The fire moved unnaturally fast. By the time first responders arrived, the entire structure had collapsed into itself, like a dying breath. What they found in the ashes wasn't what anyone expected. Yes, there were charred remnants of furniture, singed books, and scorched appliances, but beneath the floor, directly under the spot where the family dining table had once stood, they found a sealed trapdoor. One no one had reported, one no blueprint had shown. Reese was called to the scene. The trapdoor had warped from the heat, but hadn't burned through. It was old, made of thick oak and iron. When they finally got it open, a narrow ladder led down into a dirt passage, no more than 4 feet high. It was cold, damp, reeking of mold and something else, something rotted. The tunnel went on for maybe 30 yards, snaking left and right. Then it opened into a chamber, roughly dug, crude, but what was inside made several of the officers turn away. Dozens of drawings lined the walls, scratched in with charcoal ink, even blood. Most were of faces, screaming faces. Some had eyes blacked out, others were bound by X's, but all had no mouths. Below the drawings, arranged in a careful arc, were children's shoes, pairs of them, at least 20, and at the very center of the room, propped upright like some kind of shrine, was an old coat rack. On it hung 3 things: a child's dress, burnt around the collar, a cracked porcelain doll, and a mask, handmade, with a sewn mouth and hollow eye sockets. No fingerprints, no footprints, no signs of recent life, but one thing made Reese's skin crawl. The doll, the same one Elise Granger had been seen carrying in home videos, was missing its head, and that head was found in the dirt, with a camera lens embedded in one eye. The FBI was called in, so was the state. A broader investigation was launched. The tunnels, it turned out, stretched further than anyone realized. Long-forgotten mining shafts, hidden basements, drainage tunnels that hadn't been mapped in decades. They connected multiple properties, some abandoned, some still occupied. The town's foundations were quite literally cracked and hollow, which raised one terrifying possibility. Someone had been living beneath Elmridge for years, and maybe still was. A few weeks later, another child vanished. 7-year-old Liam Porter, last seen walking home from school on a snowy afternoon. No signs of struggle. His backpack was found 2 days later in a storm drain behind the church. Inside was a drawing, stick figures, a house, and something large beneath it. Long arms, a stitched mouth. Liam had titled it, "The Quiet Man." The media storm reignited. The Granger murders were no longer an isolated horror. They were part of a pattern, a dark buried lineage of something ancient, patient, and watching. As for Detective Reese, he retired not long after. Some say he started having dreams, that he began hearing things in his own wall.
That his daughter found him one morning sitting in the attic, eyes wide open, whispering, "I heard the breathing." He moved out of Elmridge 6 months later. No forwarding address. Today, the Granger case remains officially unsolved. The file is still open, but many refuse to speak of it now. The townspeople go about their days with a kind of practiced forgetfulness. They avoid the woods. They don't ask about strange noises. They don't stay up late watching true crime videos, because they've learned something most people never realize until it's too late. The scariest monsters don't break into your house. They crawl up from underneath it, and sometimes they never leave. And that brings us to the end of this dark, tangled journey into the Granger family murders. A case buried under silence, fear, and shadows that still seem to move just out of sight. Despite the evidence, the unanswered questions, and the lives shattered in its wake, no one has ever been arrested, no one has been held accountable, and no one truly knows what happened that night, except perhaps those who still refuse to speak. The Granger house is gone. The records are sealed, but in Elmridge, the story lives on. passed in whispers, half-remembered nightmares, and warning glances toward the woods when the sun starts to fall. Because maybe, just maybe, the horror wasn't just what happened. The real terror is that it could happen again, somewhere else, to someone else. Tonight, if you found this story haunting, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime and dark mystery breakdowns. And let us know in the comments. Do you think the Granger murders were the work of a single killer, or something far more sinister, buried deep beneath the surface? Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and never ignore what's hiding in the dark.